Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 2nd of May 1945. Adolf Hitler is dead. This is how the news was first broadcast to Britain late last night.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Berlin has fallen to the Russian army. The Germans surrendered at 3 o'clock this afternoon. The German army in Italy has surrendered too. Nearly 1 million enemy troops have laid down their arms. More details are emerging about the atrocities committed in Nazi concentration camps. The Lord Chancellor has said the Germans must have known what was happening. And back to holding the baby. The Demob dads who are getting lessons in childcare. The Third Reich is on the brink of collapse tonight. Its capital city, Berlin, is in Russian hands and its leader, Adolf Hitler, is dead. On all sides, the remnants of the Reich, which Hitler once said would last for 1,000 years, are besieged by rapidly advancing Allied troops. The Russian leader, Marshal Stalin, has announced that Berlin, the heart of German aggression, as he called it, surrendered to the Red Army at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Troops commanded by Marshals Zhukov and Konev have completed the rout of the German garrison after a battle that has raged over the last 2 weeks.
The heart of Germany is tonight in pieces after Red Army units smashed through the final defences to the south and east of the capital. Hitler is dead, his city in ruins. Fortress Berlin no longer stands. After encircling the city 7 days ago, the Russians pushed on towards its inner defensive ring. By last night, they had penetrated the city centre. It was a barrage unprecedented in military history, with the Russians on the march as never before. The Red Army's artillery outnumbered German tanks more than 4 to 1. A staggering 2.5 million men have now punched their way into Berlin under the hammer and sickle banner, crushing the Nazi resistance before them. This afternoon, the demoralized remains of the garrison laid down their arms and emerged from the wreckage around them. Inside the city itself, more than 120,000 German soldiers are now reported in Russian hands, with more being rounded up as each hour passes. These are scenes unthinkable just 2 years ago. The German officer corps, humiliated in its own capital, disarmed with its leadership dead and its will to fight exhausted. Proudest moment for the Russians was the capture of Berlin's Victory Column with its stone statue of Mars, the god of war. It's now a victory column for someone else. As the city lay smoking and in chaos, Moscow radio called on the Germans to regard Berlin's fall as the beginning of a new Germany. But that's not the way they see it tonight, with the Russian soldiers parading in triumph and the smell of defeat all around them.
In Britain, the news of Adolf Hitler's death was given to a calm House of Commons at about 10:30 last night. But after the BBC had interrupted programmes with the special announcement, thousands of people jammed GPO switchboards trying to telephone friends with the news. German radio said that Hitler died a hero's death, but today President Eisenhower denied that he had died in the fighting. The Russians are saying he committed suicide.
This is the last film of Adolf Hitler alive. It was taken a few weeks ago, just before his 56th birthday. The whereabouts of his body remains a mystery, but is thought to be somewhere near here, the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. When Hitler entered Paris in June 1940, he was at the height of his power. In only 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had conquered the old enemy, France, and driven our army into the sea. Hitler returned to Berlin in triumph, the triumph of his ideology of National Socialism. His means were diplomacy, dishonesty, thuggery and force, but always with the support and the votes of many Germans. So what was the source of his power? Partly it was the almost hypnotic quality of his speeches, which we've heard so many nights over the years on the radio.
Dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen, genau wie die Väter einst auch Deutschland nicht geschenkt erhielten, sondern selbst nicht schaffen mussten.
It was the seductive stage management of fascism. But it was also the obsessive hatred of Jews, communists and Democrats. After December 1941, things began to go badly wrong. Defeated by the Russian winter, he chose to declare war on America. The two most powerful countries in the world were now his enemies. After Germany's defeat at Stalingrad, the Führer became a semi-recluse. He hid away in his headquarters in East Prussia. Most Germans never saw Hitler again. It seemed that only assassination could snap the bonds of loyalty between him and the German people. But a bomb plot by army officers last summer succeeded only in wounding him. From then, Hitler appeared visibly tired. His military inspiration had long deserted him. It became a matter of holding on to the bitter end. What still remains a mystery is how this former Austrian corporal of World War I, who in his private life loved children, dogs, and polite conversation over tea, could become to many the very embodiment of evil, who almost brought the world to its knees.
German radio has announced that Hitler's successor as Führer is Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German Navy and the former commander of U-boats. The news of Hitler's death has led to rejoicing, but not everywhere. In Dublin, the Prime Minister of the Irish Free State, Eamon de Valera, expressed his condolences at the German embassy. Today, there's also come the news of the capitulation of all German forces in Italy. The announcement was made to a cheering House of Commons at 7:30 this evening by the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill.
The Italian victory is dazzling. Field Marshal Alexander's spring offensive opened less than 3 weeks ago, when Allied armies burst out of the mountains to sweep the Germans back to the north, achieving, in the words of the Field Marshal today, the complete and utter rout of the enemy forces. The Italians of Bologna, weary of Mussolini and of war, welcomed Allied troops with open arms. The 5th and 8th armies converged there and managed even to shake hands. In Milan, meanwhile, the bullet-riddled body of Mussolini was on show for all to see, alongside those of his mistress and fascist advisors. A turbulent crowd bayed its hatred. Communist partisans executed the Duce last Saturday. On Sunday, 2 German officers met Britain's General Morgan in Caserta to agree a German surrender. The general, for the Allies, spelled out the details.
The terms of the instrument of surrender will take effect from 12 noon Greenwich Mean Time on the 2nd of May. I now ask you to sign the document.
And sign they did. At noon today, almost 1 million enemy troops laid down their arms. It was the greatest unconditional surrender in history.
From all sides, the Allied forces are closing in on what remains of the Third Reich. In Central Europe, the territory occupied by German forces has now been reduced to Czechoslovakia and Western Austria. Nazi troops also remain in control of Holland, Denmark and Norway, and there are small pockets of German resistance along the Baltic and Atlantic coasts, including, of course, the Channel Islands. Inside Germany, the Russians have swept past Berlin and are pushing towards British and American positions along the River Elbe. Further west, British troops have reached the Baltic and are driving towards Hamburg. And in the south, American troops are advancing towards Salzburg, while German troops in northern Italy are beginning to lay down their arms after today's surrender. More details are emerging of the atrocities which have been committed by the Nazis in the concentration camps, where Jews and others have been imprisoned and exterminated. 3 days ago, American troops entered Dachau. It's reported that the horrors they found are worse than those already uncovered at Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. In the House of Lords, the Lord Chancellor Viscount Simon said today that the German people must have known what was happening in the concentration camps. Some of that evidence has been seen by a parliamentary delegation from Britain. I should warn you that some of the pictures in our report are distressing.
What Allied troops have found at Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen camps leaves no lingering doubt as to the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis on the innocent, most of them Jewish. At Buchenwald, our own MPs have seen the thousands of corpses, the living skeletons empty of mind and scarred of body. A few survivors told of executions. Some were clubbed to death, and incinerators received those who stubbornly refused to die. Here at Belsen, they are still dying, despite efforts to save them, victims of systematic starvation, torture, and horrific medical experiments.
Never in my life have I seen such damnable ghastliness. This morning we buried over 5,000 bodies. We don't know who they are. Behind me you can see a pit which will contain another 5,000.
There is an almost obscene contrast between the pathetic bundles of rags and bones and the stout and sullen camp commander, Joseph Kramer. He is suspected of shipping out many thousands of prisoners shortly before our troops arrived. Their fate is unknown, but the worst is feared. And Kramer's sleek and well-fed SS Guard, many of them women, seem unperturbed by the evidence of their cruelty.
Ik ben de Oberscharführer, de SS-Oberscharführer Friedrich Herzog aus Dortmund in Westfalen.
These scenes will haunt the men and women from Britain who have witnessed this epic of brutality.
I, as a member of Parliament with 9 others, visited Buchenwald concentration camp. Some people believe that the reports of what happened there are exaggerated. No words could exaggerate. We saw and we know.
At Belsen, 1,000 local citizens and their leaders have been forced to march here to confront the enormity of the crimes committed in their name. Some have denied there was any cruelty or claimed they knew nothing of what happened at Bergen-Belsen. And there's a growing feeling this nation must be forced to face up to its own inhumanity and to show remorse.
News now from the home front. A peer has cast doubt on the loyalty of some of the 40,000 German immigrants living and working in this country. Lord Aylwin said those working at the BBC monitoring service were inefficient and truculent. But the Earl of Munster told the House of Lords this afternoon that many of the Germans here were Jews who had fled from Hitler. They were making, he said, a substantial contribution to the war effort, and their loyalty was not remotely in question. More than 1,000 wireless listeners have been fined £10 for failing to buy a licence. Some listeners have had their radio sets confiscated as a punishment. Listeners are asked to renew their licences promptly and to keep them handy for inspection. They cost 10 shillings and more than 9 million of them have been taken out. And finally, demobbed British servicemen who've enjoyed little family life for the past 5 years are being given a crash course in baby care, courtesy of the Ministry of Health. It's hoped their newfound expertise could improve husband and wife relationships.
One way of solving the domestic problem is to train fathers to look after Junior, so that mother can go out to the pictures once in a while without her evening being spoiled, wondering what's going wrong at home. This new idea in bringing up father in the way he should go is being carried out at the French Hospital Nursery, London, and very successful it is too. Now the pupils are going to put their lesson into practice. It's funny how the strongest men usually become all fingers and thumbs when they have to hold a baby. Now comes the moment. Gently does it. Well, if all else fails, these chaps can always go out and get themselves jobs as nursemaids.
And finally, the headlines again. The war in Europe is nearing its end. The capital of the Third Reich has surrendered and its leader, Adolf Hitler, is dead. More concentration camps have been liberated. And in Italy, 1 million German troops have surrendered. That was the news tonight, the 2nd of May, 1945. Good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 3rd of May 1945. Germany is thought to be close to surrender. Today, Hamburg was captured. British troops entered Germany's second city without a shot being fired. 60 miles to the east of Hamburg, British troops have linked up with the Red Army.
I'm very, very glad to have met you. Very glad indeed.
Благодарим вас за помощь, которую оказали вы нам в войне против гитлеровской Германии.
Thank you very much.
Lord Haw-Haw, the Nazi propagandist William Joyce, has made his last drunken broadcast.
You may not hear from me again for a few months. I say, es lebe Deutschland.
The men of General Slim's 14th Army have recaptured Rangoon after 3 years of Japanese rule. And we've heard the last of them. Air raid warnings are to end, the shelters are to close, and evacuees are to return to our big cities. In London tonight, Mr. Churchill and his ministers are standing by, hoping for news of a German surrender. Across the Third Reich, the Allied noose is tightening with advances on all fronts. American forces in the south are advancing along the Danube towards Linz, but German resistance is said to remain strong in the Czech heartlands around Prague. In the north, British and Russian forces have linked up for the first time in the Baltic town of Wismar. British forces have also swept across the Kiel Canal after taking Hamburg, which fell without a shot being fired.
The fall of Hamburg into British hands looked casual, more like manoeuvres than the great triumph it was. This afternoon, tanks of Desert Rat fame from 7th Armoured Division rumbled into the Reich's second city, which is also the continent's largest port. They were led by the local German garrison commander who'd negotiated the surrender. It was an eerie scene, the streets at first empty of all but a few German policemen under Allied orders to enforce a 48-hour curfew to prevent looting. Most of Hamburg's population of 1 million was sheltering among the ruins of the city, whose centre was flattened by 6 massive Allied raids 2 years ago. Gradually, however, a few civilians turned out to watch a sight for which their Führer had never prepared them, the entry of their victors. Arriving in a captured staff car, a British colonel made his entry into Hamburg City Hall look just as routine. Outside, near a branch of the familiar chain store, they toasted one of the greatest Allied victories since D-Day. Southeast of Hamburg, the last German forces were desperately trying to fight off their Russian pursuers and make it across rivers to British lines to surrender. But for most, there'll be no way out except to Siberia. The Red Army today closed the trap by linking up with British forces. This exciting moment, so awaited for the past 5 years, came outside the Baltic town of Wismar. Men of 6th Airborne rushing to meet the Soviet tank crews.
Now you're past Stalin soldiers, and I'm pleased to meet you. We've both come a long way together, and we've done it together.
Армия очень довольна, те наши союзники также били врага, как и мы.
What does that mean, Charles? Very good.
What does that mean?
Eh?
What does that mean?
How do I know?
How do I? Stalin's voice. Well, they got it, and I'm an Irishman.
There was little problem persuading soldiers from both armies to relive this fantastic moment several times for the cameras.
The whole of northern Germany is tonight on the brink of collapse. Our correspondents report that German civilians seem dumbfounded by the wreckage of the Wehrmacht. The roads are clogged with refugees and with German troops wanting to surrender en masse to the British. Many have fled in panic from the Russians. Many civilians, particularly in the towns, are starving.
Their ordeal is endless. After the horror of war, now they are struggling across the devastated countryside, fleeing their homes in Prussia and Silesia to escape the advancing Red Army and the fear of rape and murder. The rumours of Russian atrocities in German villages like Nemmersdorf have spread, and these people are desperate to reach the relative safety of the territory occupied by the Allies. Hundreds of thousands of women and their children throng the roads day and night, carrying what they can. Walking is almost the only means of escape. Few trains have been spared by the Allies' bombs. The refugees wait for days on station platforms, and when at last a train arrives, they swarm in and on it, desperate to escape in a westward direction. The German cities they arrive at lie in ruins. There is little food, and further danger awaits them where there's no shelter. Even the youngest are aware of the degradation of their families and their country. The Allies are providing some medical care, but it will be an enormous task coping with the numbers hemorrhaging west, feeding them and restoring order. This is a humiliated population. Everything underlines this, even the indignity of disinfection with DDT. There can be no privacy, even for the women. And the smallest, most uncomprehending child must endure the misery of a nation dispossessed.
There's good news from the other side of the world. General Slim's 14th Army has captured Rangoon, the capital of Burma. Japanese forces are still in control of much of eastern China and Southeast Asia. But the recapture of Rangoon will boost British morale and means that Lord Mountbatten's Southeast Asia Command can now turn its attention to the recapture of British Malaya and Singapore.
Yesterday, Allied forces landed 20 miles south of Rangoon as part of Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten's combined operation to capture the Burmese capital. Only the mud slowed them up. The landing force met no resistance, a measure of the speed and success of the 14th Army's offensive begun 1 month ago. The push down through Burma has driven the Japanese 300 miles in 25 days. But it's the seaborne troops that are the first to reach the Burmese capital just in time before the monsoon rains, which are expected any day now. The final drive on the city was preceded by a bombardment. Australian, Indian and East African units were all part of the 14th Army's effort. But yesterday news was received that the Japanese, unable to offer further resistance, had fled Rangoon, and today Allied columns went in. It was the turn of the men of what has often been called the Forgotten Army to be liberators. They were greeted by the Burmese, who seemed stunned that their city had been spared a protracted battle. After this bitter jungle campaign, it was the first sight of civilization many of the troops had seen for months. Some Japanese stragglers were captured, and there are likely to be many more in the days ahead, because the speed of this offensive has left thousands of troops cut off. The King has called it a brilliant success. Today's victory is another sign that the Japanese war machine is close to collapse.
Back now to the war in Europe, and when British troops entered Hamburg, they discovered that William Joyce, who's been broadcasting Nazi propaganda from the radio studio there, had fled. Joyce, better known to us as Lord Haw-Haw, is rumoured to be on his way to Denmark. British troops missed him by about 12 hours.
His was the voice that sank 1,000 ships. This was the man whose target was our morale, his mission to sap our will to win. His sinister broadcasts always began in the same chilling way.
Germany calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reichs under ambush. Station DXB on the 31-meter band.
William Joyce is on the run in northern Germany tonight, but shouldn't be too difficult to find. The ugly scar across his right cheek, a visible reminder of his dark past as a propagandist for fascism. In 1932, he joined Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Rallies like this one at Olympia were closely modelled on similar events in Germany as Hitler came to power. Mosley spent the war in a British prison, but Joyce fled to Germany and soon got a job broadcasting for Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. Every night, millions of people in Britain heard his mixture of lies and half-truths, never quite knowing which was which.
The New York Times reports the British cruiser Exeter has been so severely damaged by the artillery of the Admiral Graf Spee that it is impossible to make the ship seaworthy again.
The nickname Lord Haw-Haw gave Joyce the image of a clown, but in the psychological war of words, the Nazi newsman did more damage than we would like to admit. That was until, from the ruins of Hamburg, he made his last pathetic broadcast a few days ago. By now, the clown was morally broken and drunk as he rambled his way into history.
You may not hear from me again for a few months, and therefore I say to you, Es lebe Deutschland, Heil Hitler, and farewell.
Lord Haw-Haw on the run tonight. The £50 million hoard of treasure discovered recently in a deep salt mine near Germany's border with Czechoslovakia was moved today under American guard to a secret store. It took 30 10-ton lorries to carry it and another 27 to transport art treasures hidden in the same mine. From markings on the ingots, it's evident that the Germans had stolen much of the gold from occupied countries. Also found in the mine were trunks crammed with loot taken by the SS, including paintings. A spokesman at General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims said no one could estimate what all these valuables represented in terms of the dead bodies of their rightful owners. Financial experts are now making an extensive survey of assets Germany holds abroad. It's expected they'll be handed over as reparation. Government departments made a number of announcements today that show we're no longer in danger of war on the home front. Air raid warnings will cease, public air raid shelters will close, and evacuees will soon be able to return to their homes in London, provided, of course, their homes are still standing.
The numbers of Londoners sleeping in the capital's underground shelters have dwindled, but they will remain open to provide refuge for those who lost their homes during the Blitz. Other public shelters will be closed in due course. They saved many lives during the German bombing raids and the missile attacks of the last year. Over 1 million defence workers, including the Home Guard, will receive notice of demobilisation from June the 2nd. Last night, the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, praised their spirit of comradeship and service. At midday today, the National Air Raid Warning System was discontinued. The sirens have sounded 1,224 times in London since the beginning of the war. They were last heard in March during a doodlebug attack on London. Yesterday, the Ministry of Health sent out telegrams to local authorities with the message, "Operate London return plans." So within weeks, many of the 500,000 mothers and children who've been evacuated over the years from Greater London will be on their way home. Up to 8 trains, each carrying 6,000 evacuees, will reach London daily. For most, it will be a joyful journey. But there's a growing tally of children who've been orphaned or, in some cases, abandoned by their parents in the past 5 years.
1,300 people in England and Wales were sent to jail in the first 3 months of this year for being work-shy. Figures reveal that another 18,000 were prosecuted for absenteeism or being persistently late without excuse. They're among the 6 million workers in industry, agriculture and construction who are covered by the Essential Work Order of 1941. This makes absenteeism an offence, but it promises secure employment. And finally, the headlines again. The British Second Army has captured Hamburg and linked up with the Red Army. In an atmosphere of panic and chaos, millions of German civilians are fleeing from the east. And the British 14th Army have captured Rangoon. That was the news tonight, the 3rd of May, 1945. Good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 4th of May 1945. The German armies in Northern Europe have surrendered. They capitulated to Field Marshal Montgomery just after 6 o'clock this evening.
The German delegation will now sign this paper.
We have a special dispatch from the BBC's Chester Wilmot, who witnessed the historic moment.
It's 10 minutes past 6 on Friday, May the 4th, the hour and the day for which British fighting men and women have been fighting and working and waiting for 5 years and 8 months.
In Berlin, the Russians have been searching Hitler's bunker, but they say there's no sign of his body. In Bavaria, the US 7th Army has captured Hitler's mountain retreat of Berchtesgaden. Another 10,000 British prisoners of war have been liberated by the advancing Red Army.
I've never felt so happy in all my life, have you? Well, I'm ready to burst any minute now.
And here at home, London stores are preparing for Summer Fashion Week. 3 hours ago, in a tent on Lüneburg Heath near Hamburg, the main German armies in Europe surrendered unconditionally to Field Marshal Montgomery. A statement from 21st Army Group headquarters says that all enemy forces in Holland, northwest Germany and Denmark have surrendered with effect from 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The BBC's Chester Wilmot, who's been with the British Army since the D-Day landings, witnessed the German surrender.
This is Chester Wilmot speaking from Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters on a high, windswept hill on the wild Lüneburger Heath near the River Elbe. It's 10 minutes past 6 on Friday, May the 4th, the hour and the day for which British fighting men and women and British peoples throughout the world have been fighting and working and waiting for 5 years and 8 months. The commanders of the German forces opposing Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group have come to this headquarters today to make unconditional surrender.
Now, we've assembled here today to accept the surrender terms which have been made with a delegation from the German Army. I will now read out the terms of that instrument of surrender. The German command agrees to the surrender of all German armed forces in Holland, in northwest Germany, including the Frisian Islands and Heligoland and all other islands. The German delegation will now sign this paper.
First, the Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, General Admiral von Friedeberg, put his signature on the deed.
Now, General Kinsall will sign next.
The German representatives came to Montgomery's headquarters yesterday, but then they were not empowered to surrender unconditionally. And they were shown a map which revealed to them for the first time the full extent of our breakthrough to the Baltic. When the chief of their delegation, Admiral von Friedeberg, saw it, he broke down and wept. It was quite clear that he had had no idea how bad the situation was. This surrender does not affect Norway or any of the territory in Czechoslovakia, Austria or southern Germany, where enemy troops are still opposing Russia and the Western Allies. But their resistance can't go on long now that both the extreme south, Italy, and the extreme north have surrendered unconditionally, delivering 2 million German troops into our hands in 1 week.
General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, declared tonight that on land, sea and in the air, the Germans have been thoroughly whipped. Their only recourse is to surrender, he said. Today's news means that German troops in Western Holland as well as Denmark will be laying down their arms. But fighting is continuing along the German-held territories around Prague and in Western Austria. American forces today took Innsbruck and the town of Berchtesgaden, capturing the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat.
As so many times before, it was the RAF that had paved the way in bombing raids deep into the Austrian Alps. A massive onslaught more than a week ago had badly damaged Hitler's last stronghold, the so-called Eagle's Nest, and delivered the final humiliation to the German command. The unassailable had been assailed. This morning, units of the 7th Army had pushed their way through from Salzburg, meeting little opposition and reaching Berchtesgaden by late afternoon, along with troops from the 2nd French Armoured Division. For General Patch's troops, it was the climax of an exhausting campaign that began in southern France and took them triumphant across Europe. Finally, from Hitler's own mountain terrace, there was time to reflect on the closing hours of the war. In days gone by, it was here that the Führer had planned his conquest of Europe, laying the strategy for the systematic annihilation of the Jews and the brutal subjugation of a dozen countries. From Norway to North Africa, through France and the Low Countries, east through Czechoslovakia, Poland and Russia. Today, the Allies were picking their way through the mountain fortress, the command bunker, once so heavily fortified. The boast of all Germany. No shortage of ghosts here. While in Berlin, the hunt goes on for the body of Hitler himself. A hunt among the ruined buildings and ruined lives that now represent his only legacy.
Another 10,000 British prisoners of war have been liberated by the advancing Russian army. The War Office announced this afternoon that camps Stalag 3A at Luckenwalde and Stalag 4B at Mühlberg, both south of Berlin, have been liberated by the Red Army. The next of kin will be informed as soon as possible. The great majority of the 140,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners of war held by the Germans are now believed to have been freed. A large contingent are from Stalag 11B, which was liberated by the British a few days ago.
At Stalag 11B, hundreds of cheering British prisoners of war poured through the gates, free at last. They gave the victory sign, and there was hope and relief on every face. The fear of a mass slaughter of prisoners by the defeated Germans had haunted them for weeks. One man here held the record, prisoner of war the longest time of all.
How long have you been here? 5 years, 8 months. 5 years, 8 months. What day of the war? Is it 4th of September 1939.
You're the first prisoner of war, no?
Well, there's an argument between my air gunner and myself who was in front. I think I was the first.
Good show.
140,000 British prisoners were taken by the Germans and Italians. Now comes the enormous task of bringing them home to England. Trucks take them to holding stations in France and Belgium, where they're being debriefed while awaiting air transport. The order's gone out that getting the liberated prisoners home is our #1 priority. But there's a shortage of planes, and so far only 20,000 have come back. The Americans are luckier. Hundreds of their released soldiers have been brought direct to an airstrip near the Moosburg camp, where C-47s have been massed for the airlift. One eyewitness counted 57 planes taking off in a single hour. That's nearly one every minute. But for a few lucky British POWs who managed to find one of our planes to hitch a ride on, the excitement and the anticipation was plain to see. After years behind barbed wire, in just over 2 hours' time, they would be back on English soil again.
Once again this afternoon, the people of Holland welcomed British and American bombers. They flew over to drop another 400 tons of food to the people of Rotterdam, Leiden and The Hague, many of whom are starving.
In stepped-up action to drop food to the famine-stricken areas of Holland, the American Army Air Force has joined the operation begun a week ago by RAF Bomber Command in spectacular drops of tons of food. In recent weeks, thousands more of the undernourished have been near death in occupied northwest Holland, an area bypassed in the Allied advance on Germany. Over 3 million people are threatened with starvation after the Germans blew up the sea wall and flooded large areas of arable land. Meagre German rations ceased altogether last week. Today, German commanders opened one main road for Allied food convoys. But it's the airdrops, ordered in response to appeals from Queen Wilhelmina, that have provided urgent relief. Rations by the millions replaced bombs in the weapons bays of the flying fortresses. They were then rained down on the dropping areas where the Dutch waited patiently. People collected it by whatever means were to hand. Amazingly, resistance reports said that so robust were the sacks that not more than an eighth of the supplies appeared lost in the direct drops of this Allied manna from heaven. Liberator bombers joined the armada of fortresses flying low over the Dutch cities. The long-suffering and brave Dutch people now know that victory and liberation are at hand.
Home news now, and train services will run as usual on VE Day, the date of which has still to be announced, although it will be a public holiday. Relief trains will be provided in the late evening for those returning home after the celebrations. But the London transport strike is spreading. Nearly 7,000 workers failed to report for duty this morning in protest over the new summer schedules. Cinemas across the country will be showing pictures of 2-year-old Patricia Barney, who was kidnapped from her home in North London earlier this week. It's only the second time that Scotland Yard have used a cinema SOS of this kind. London stores are holding Summer Fashion Week starting next Monday. And it seems, as far as designers are concerned, that the war in Europe is over.
Some people can't wait to slip into something more liberated. Since clothes rationing came in June 1941, women have on average used 94% of their coupons, but fashion demands stamina. This week, women were reported to be queuing for 3 hours at 6 a.m. to pay up to 15 shillings for a pair of fully fashioned stockings that cost 4 and 6 before the war. Now, for the summer of 1945, the look is slimmer, more tailored. Perhaps a little less than flattering for those who've had to survive on a starchy wartime diet. But new fabrics, fibro, tricoline, gore, rayon, make fresh shapes, drapes and pleats possible. Even so, certain outfits still have an echo of the make, do and mend philosophy. Renovation patterns, showing how to recut old frocks, are doing brisk business. Women's fashion houses are working flat out, with waiting lists of up to 8 months for a suit to meet the demand for homecoming outfits. Already shoe manufacturers are reporting a shortage of calf leather for shoe uppers, and of blue leather in particular, for those planning to be kitted out in patriotic red, white and blue.
The Royal Academy's summer exhibition opens tomorrow, and today at the Private View more than £10,000 worth of paintings were sold. The centrepieces of the show are the new state portraits of the King and Queen, painted by Gerald Kelly. Critics are saying that the portrait of Queen Elizabeth in her coronation robes isn't very flattering. It makes her look middle-aged, says one. Another points out the strange though traditional angle at which the King holds his sceptre, like a fishing rod. Also attracting attention was Mr. Russell Flint's portrait of Vivian Leigh as Cleopatra, and a nude by Harold Williamson entitled Isabel Begins Her Day. It's thought the exhibition will become known as Victory Academy. And so the headlines again. This evening, General Montgomery took the surrender of the German armies of Northern Europe, and General Eisenhower proclaimed that the German forces had been whipped on land, sea and in the air. Hitler's retreat at Berchtesgaden has been captured, but in Berlin there's no sign of his body. That was the news tonight, the 4th of May, 1945. Good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 5th of May 1945. The German armies in the south and in Austria have surrendered. Nearly 500,000 troops have given themselves up. Prague has risen up against its Nazi occupiers. A call for help has been broadcast.
Prague is in great danger. We are calling urgently our allies to help.
There's more evidence of Nazi atrocities in the concentration camps. Another was discovered today in Austria. In Denmark and Holland, people have been celebrating their first day of freedom for more than 5 years. And 12-year-old Petula Clark has been chosen to sing in Trafalgar Square on VE Day.
Looking at his mammy with eyes so shiny blue.
The war in Europe is nearly at an end. After the surrender yesterday of the German armies in Holland, Denmark and northwest Germany, today enemy forces in southern Germany and much of Austria capitulated. Tonight, the only areas which remain under Nazi control are in Norway, Austria and Czechoslovakia, where fighting is reported to be fierce. Nevertheless, the final surrender of all German forces now seems imminent.
Read these faces because they're telling the final chapter. Austria, once annexed by Germany, is now being detached by the Americans. The same people who cheered them today cheered the Nazis just a few years ago. The city of Innsbruck fell yesterday as the Nazis' resistance crumbled dramatically across the country. Today, the US 5th and 7th Armies swept east along the Inn Valley. By dusk tonight, they'd covered more than 20 miles. These are troops who fought their way right across Europe after their landing in the south of France. Today, Eisenhower called it one of the longest left hooks in history. The men who took the punch flew in today to formalize the ceasefire, officers of the German 19th Army Group. Some of them couldn't surrender fast enough. Further east, their compatriots have refused to give in to the Soviets, apparently expecting little in the way of mercy. One man who won't get much of that was captured by the US 7th Army today. Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of Poland, soon to face trial for atrocities and #1 on the Polish wanted list. As you pass through the Austrian towns, it's finally the Germans wearing the blank expressions of defeat. 2 German armies, nearly 500,000 men, have now surrendered to the Americans. More will follow.
Today has been the first day of freedom for the Dutch and the Danes since 1940. In Denmark, the British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, have entered the country from the south amid tremendous rejoicing. Their former commander, Field Marshal Montgomery, has issued an order of the day thanking all Second Army troops for their victory.
Savouring the British Army's sweetest victory, Field Marshal Montgomery recorded this message of personal thanks to all his commanders in 21st Army Group.
Few commanders can have had such loyal service as you have given me, and so let us embark on what lies ahead, full of joy and optimism. We have won the German war. Let us now win the peace.
After Monty spoke, units from his Desert Rats of 7th Armoured Division crossing the Kiel Canal became the first British troops through Denmark's frontier to signal the formal end to Nazi occupation. After a week of on-off confusion, Danish police emerged from the underground as part of the welcoming party. In the capital, Copenhagen, liberation wouldn't wait for the Allies to arrive. Ever since the surrender announcement last night, people have taken to the streets. There's been wild celebrating, singing of the likes of Tipperary, ringing of church bells, with the newly helmeted and well-armed Danish resistance forces, some secretly trained in Sweden, suddenly emerging to take control. Inevitably, German army cafes and SS offices have been targets for ransacking, with whatever documents remained scattered joyfully, if mindlessly. But this afternoon, the situation turned sporadically chaotic. Resistance fighters began shooting at German units. Pitched gun battles also broke out as the hated collaborator Danish SS auxiliaries fought off being rounded up. There was sustained shooting in this incident before the Danish traitor was flushed out. Hundreds more like him were being led away all day to face a newly promulgated death penalty. In today's shootings, dozens of people were killed and many more injured. Into this mixture of gaiety and turmoil flew in this afternoon the Allied advance party with British airborne troops. General Dewing, Eisenhower's representative, was greeted at Kastrup airfield by a fully turned out honour guard of the so-called Danforce of Danish resistance fighters.
Another Nazi concentration camp was entered by American forces today. When the Americans arrived at Mauthausen, they discovered terrible scenes of suffering, including a mass grave containing an estimated 10,000 bodies. Mauthausen is about 10 miles east of the Austrian city of Linz. I must warn you that you may be disturbed by some of the scenes in this report.
The sun shone brightly today. Spring was in the air in the land of Mozart. And from the outside, to American eyes, Mauthausen was just a camp. Inside, the GIs stumbled into yet another nightmare. Bodies, bodies, and more bodies. Some piled up for disposal, some dead in bunks inside barracks. Each body skeletal beyond belief, shrunken to skin and bone. It was like a scene from some great medieval painting depicting the Day of Judgment and the horrors of hell. The living often were as starved and shrunken as the dead. Mauthausen, the Americans discovered, was one more Nazi factory of death. And yet it seems the one most dreaded by slave laborers themselves. Americans found hungry survivors in their tens of thousands from all nations, Poles and Russians, Spaniards, Jews and Gypsies, even the odd American. Tens of thousands, too, had been murdered. Life expectancy for those toiling in the camp's stone quarry was under 3 months. Survivors said the SS killed them in 6 ways. You could be gassed, shot, starved, dropped off the quarry cliff, given to the dogs, or exposed in the winter snow. The sick lay 5 to a bunk. There was no food, no clean clothing, no linen. Sanitary conditions were unspeakable. Lice were everywhere. There were gas chambers and crematoria. Mauthausen was mother to a whole network of sub-camps in Austria. Local people have been ordered to bury the dead. American doctors are trying to salvage the living.
Other war news now. The widow of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has said that he did not die from his wounds, as the Germans have claimed, but that he took his own life to avoid being hanged. There have been reports that Field Marshal Rommel was involved in the unsuccessful plot to assassinate Hitler. Czech resistance fighters are reported to have taken to the streets today in Prague, the capital which has been under German occupation since March 1939. At lunchtime, Prague radio was interrupted by a voice calling urgently for help.
This afternoon at the BBC monitoring unit in Caversham, an emergency appeal was picked up from Prague radio. It's believed to have come from an escaped prisoner of war.
Do not let Prague be destroyed. We need the greatest help possible, and outside there is a battle raging. We don't know how long it will last or how long we can hold out.
The Czech capital has been in Nazi hands since March 1939. It's the last great capital in Central Europe still to be liberated. But Prague has survived 5 years of war relatively unscathed. German oppression has clearly not dulled the spirit of the people, though in their minds the preservation of the city can be no compensation for Hitler's betrayal of the Munich Agreement 6 years ago. General Patton's Third Army and 2 units of the Red Army are now responding to the call for help. Tonight, Germany's hold on the Czech capital is slipping fast.
The French Wimbledon tennis champion Jean Barotra has scored another victory, and it involves 2 former prime ministers of France. The story begins in a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps.
Barotra was among a dozen high-ranking officials who in great secrecy were kept prisoners in the 12th century Schloss Itter in the Tyrolean Alps. Although the castle was administered as an outpost of the Dachau death camp, the prisoners of Schloss Itter were well treated and fed, suffering mainly from boredom. Between 1924 and 1932, Barotra was seeded amongst the world's top 10 tennis players, winning Wimbledon singles twice and the men's doubles 3 times. After the German occupation, he served as sports minister in the collaborationist Vichy government, but he later changed allegiance and was arrested when attempting to reach de Gaulle's Free French in North Africa. Imprisoned at Schloss Itter, Barotra kept fit by running around the battlements up to 90 circuits a day. Yesterday, the castle's commanding officer contacted units of the US 36th Infantry Division arriving in a nearby town and offered to surrender. But as soon as an American advance party arrived in the castle, the Schloss came under attack from 300 SS troops. The Wehrmacht commander who had called in the Americans was killed by SS fire in the castle courtyard. As GIs and Wehrmacht guards fired back at the SS, Barotra, disguised as an Austrian peasant, slipped out of the castle to gather American reinforcements. After a 4-hour battle, they finally brought the castle under Allied control. The liberated prisoners include 2 former French prime ministers, Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, as well as Generals Gamelin and Weygand. Relations between the captives inside the castle had been tense because of their varying links with the Vichy regime.
Here, an opinion poll carried out by the Gallup organisation has shown that a majority of those questioned would vote against the Conservatives in the coming general election. 67% said they would support Labour, Liberals and other parties, against 33% who said they would vote for Mr Churchill and the Conservatives. Petula Clark, the 12-year-old girl from North London who's been called Britain's answer to Shirley Temple, has been chosen to entertain the crowds in Trafalgar Square on VE Day.
Looking at his mammy with eyes so shiny blue.
That's my kid. No wonder Corporal Clark was proud when he heard his little girl on the wireless singing for him. When the postman brought little Petula Clark a pile of letters after her first broadcast, she was surprised. She's used to it now because she's become a regular star with a regular fan mail. But when she's at school, she forgets all about being a star and puzzles over the same things that bother most schoolgirls. In fact, don't look now, but sometimes she has to rub it out and do it again. A good all-round scholar, but not brilliant. That's what teacher calls her. Well, she seems to have the answer right this time. And when playtime comes, Petula's always well in the picture.
Looking at his mammy with eyes so shiny blue makes you think that heaven is coming close to you.
Petula Clark, who will be singing on VE Day. The headlines again tonight. 2 more German armies have surrendered. The citizens of Prague have risen in revolt. Denmark and Holland are celebrating their liberation, and there's further evidence of Nazi atrocities. That was the news on the 5th of May, 1945. Good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 7th of May 1945. Germany has surrendered. Tomorrow has been declared Victory in Europe Day. Germany's unconditional surrender was finally signed early this morning at Allied headquarters in Reims. Large crowds have gathered in Piccadilly Circus, where victory celebrations have already begun. But fighting continues in Prague, where civilians are taking on SS troops. And the bodies of Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his family have been found in Berlin. There's still no sign of Hitler's body. The war in Europe is over. The formal act, which ended 5 years and 8 months of fighting, took place at 20 to 3 this morning in a schoolhouse in Reims, the Supreme Allied headquarters northeast of Paris. There, the Allies received the unconditional surrender of Germany. Resistance has ceased in all areas where the German government is still in touch with its forces. Tomorrow will be Victory in Europe Day, and it and the day after have been declared public holidays. Our first report tonight is on the moment the Germans formally accepted defeat. It was witnessed by the BBC's reporter Thomas Cadet.
Hello BBC, this is Thomas Cadet reporting from Supreme Headquarters. Yes, I saw it. I saw the formal acknowledgement by Germany's military leaders of their country's complete and utter defeat by land, in the air and at sea. The final act had little or nothing outwardly dramatic about it. If the sense of drama was there, and it was because we carried it in our own hearts, remembering that this meant liberation, freedom from suffering, and spared lives for countless thousands in tortured Europe. The Germans entered the room amid a complete silence that was very soon broken by the activities of the photographer. General Jodl came first. Admiral Friedeburg followed in sober navy blue, and then Oxenius, the aide-de-camp, brought up the rear. The documents were, first, the Act of Unconditional Surrender, signed by each of the 4 chief delegates representing jointly Great Britain and America, Russia, France, and Germany. One moment there was in which pity might have come near. After he had signed away a freedom already lost, General Jodl rose to his feet. Facing General Beadle-Smith, the German said these words. With this signature, the German people and the German Wehrmacht are, for better or for worse, delivered into the victor's hands. In a low voice he said, in this hour I can only express the hope that the victor will treat them with generosity.
The news of surrender was broadcast to the German people at 2 o'clock this afternoon from the last radio station under Nazi control at Flensburg on the Danish border. It was broadcast by the new Foreign Minister, Count Schwerin von Krosigk.
Niemand darf sich über die Schwere der Bedingungen hinwegtäuschen, die unsere Gegner dem deutschen Volk auferlegen wird.
Meanwhile, the Japanese government has attacked the surrender. It's accused the German government of breaking a promise. It said today, Germany has betrayed us and stabbed us in the back. It had been hoped that the Prime Minister here would broadcast the news of Germany's surrender this evening. But after continuing disagreement with Marshal Stalin, Mr. Churchill and President Truman have agreed that they will formally announce the surrender at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, our time. Marshal Stalin will broadcast the news to the Russian people the day after tomorrow. Impatient for news, crowds are already massing in the centre of London. They say they're going to stay there all night and celebrate, announcement or no announcement. Despite the surrender, German forces are continuing to resist a popular uprising on the streets of Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. The uprising began 2 days ago. The fighting is sustained and violent. But 2 columns of General Patton's tanks are reported to be within 7 miles of the city.
In contrast to the rest of Europe, there's no mood of celebration in Prague and no time for it. Here, the killing goes on, street to street, house to house, as the war enters its final hours on the continent. In the city centre and in many of the suburbs, Czech partisans were attempting to take on the retreating Germans. Many of them were said to be murdering their way out of Prague in displays of barbarity not seen in the 6 years of their occupation. Heavy fighting has gone on around the radio station, now controlled by Czech fighters who earlier appealed for assistance. Today, they warned the Germans that fighting on after their country's surrender would bring serious consequences. And even as the SS appeared on the streets, their own commander accused them of breaching the rules of war and ordered them to cease fire. So far, his words have gone unheeded. All day long, the picture here has been confused as the street barricades went up and the residents sought to take back their city. Many were urged to advance and engage the Germans wherever they found them. Already, some signs of the Nazi occupation were being removed, though it may be some time before the fighting dies down. For now, Prague has scented freedom, even as the SS units exact revenge for the war they've just lost. Many Czechs may still have to die on the streets of the capital before their country can join the party. Even so, it's clear they're on their way.
The bodies of the Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels and his family have been found in Berlin. It's rumoured that Goebbels and his wife Magda killed themselves in a suicide pact, but that she had first poisoned her children. Although the German Army of Occupation in Holland surrendered 2 days ago, sporadic fighting continues. Today, while Allied troops entered Rotterdam and were greeted with flowers, German snipers in Amsterdam killed and wounded civilians when they fired on crowds celebrating in the city.
The German surrender in Holland has been in slow motion, though no people were more hungry for liberation than the Dutch. Rotterdam today was bristling with flags and a warm welcome for the handful of Allied envoys venturing to make contact. Town and country alike seethed in anticipation. The Nazis found the Dutch a stubborn people, so they made their 5 years of occupation particularly brutal. In Amsterdam, too, the crowds were out, only to break and run as shots were fired at them. Despite the ceasefire and surrender, German troops are still about. There were killed and wounded today in Amsterdam. One report said a body of German Marines had panicked and fired. A sour note on what has been Holland's first effective day of freedom from Nazi rule. In small Dutch towns, collaborators with the Nazis have been paying the price. Armed resistance men have rounded them up for eventual trial. The Germans have undertaken to disarm Holland's own SS. It was a day for rough justice. The shaven head was a badge of shame.
In the Far East, the British Pacific Fleet today joined in the pounding of Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands. And the island of Okinawa has been shelled by the American fleet. The Americans first landed on Okinawa 1 month ago. The capture of the island would be of great strategic value because of its proximity to the Japanese mainland.
Since American troops landed on this island on the 1st of April, they've been fighting for it inch by inch. Bitter, close-quarter engagements, flushing out the defenders with flamethrowers and hand grenades. At least 30,000 of them have been killed so far, but only a few hundred surrendered, a measure of the importance of this place just 600 miles from Japan's home islands. In the last few days, a Japanese counterattack has been beaten back, and with it, any real hope of forcing the Americans off Okinawa has vanished. American forces have been using dozens of naval vessels offshore to bombard the Japanese positions. In the process, much of the island has been pulverized, and with recent rain, this is making it tough going for tanks and other heavy weapons. Thousands of civilians have also died in the bombardments. As American troops have gained ground, traumatized people have stumbled from underground shelters. Many had been armed and told to join the struggle to the death in defense of the island. For the last 3 days, the offshore British and American fleets have been under intense air attacks. For the 5th occasion since the operation began, hundreds of Japanese bombers attacked, but many flew straight into clouds of flak and paid the price. Kamikaze suicide planes have been used again, a sign of Japanese desperation. More than 40 Allied ships have been sunk, but none of the carriers vital to the operation has been seriously damaged so far.
A funeral service has been held in Neustadt on the Baltic coast of Germany for thousands of concentration camp prisoners. 4 days ago, they became the victims of a tragic mistake when RAF fighters bombed their ships, which were being used as floating prisons.
4 days ago, hours before the surrender in North Germany, RAF Typhoons like these joined in smashing German shipping, attempting to flee to Scandinavia. Targets included 3 ships at anchor in Lübeck Bay off the port of Neustadt. Intelligence led the pilots to believe these vessels too were loading fleeing German troops. In fact, they'd been commandeered by the SS and turned into floating concentration camps for thousands of inmates to be concealed from the advancing Allies. Most of those crammed in the holds died in the rocketing and bombing. Biggest of the ships set ablaze and sunk by the Typhoons was the pre-war liner Cap Arcona. On board, up to 5,000 concentration camp victims the Allies were bent on liberating tragically perished. Corpses washed up around the bay in growing numbers have been buried in mass graves along the beaches at Neustadt. It's now feared the final death toll could exceed 8,000. Today, concentration camp survivors join British forces now in control of Neustadt in a solemn funeral with full military honours. No official British comment on the disaster has been forthcoming.
Here at home, Dartmoor Prison may be used to hold important Nazis such as Himmler and Dönitz. The prison is currently being cleared of all its civilian inmates. The plan is to turn it into a military jail while the Allies debate whether or not to put Nazi criminals on trial. More than 146,000 civilians in Britain have been killed or injured during the course of the war, it was announced today. Of the dead, 26,920 were men. 25,392 were women. 7,736 children died. 2-year-old Patricia Barney, who was kidnapped 5 days ago, was found in London and taken home by her parents earlier today. Scotland Yard had taken the rare step of sending her picture to cinemas, and it seems that this SOS has worked. She'd been abducted by a woman, and when found, she was carrying a doll and a little cot. If you're planning to decorate your house for the victory celebrations and are short of coupons, don't worry. There's been a government announcement that until the end of May you can buy cotton bunting without them, provided it's red, white and blue and it doesn't cost more than 1 3 a square yard. But there's a warning, supplies are limited, so buy now to avoid disappointment. And so the headlines again. Germany has surrendered. The Prime Minister will broadcast at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The King at 9 in the evening. Both tomorrow and the day after will be public holidays. But Britain has already begun to celebrate. And that was the news on the 7th of May, 1945. Good night. Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 8th of May 1945. Britain is celebrating victory in Europe. Huge crowds are outside Buckingham Palace from where the King has tonight broadcast to the Empire.
Today, we give thanks to God for a great deliverance. Speaking from our empire's oldest capital city, war-battered, but never for one moment daunted or dismayed. Speaking from London, I ask you to join with me in that act of thanksgiving.
There are also huge crowds in Whitehall, where a few moments ago the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, told them it was a victory for the cause of freedom.
This is your victory. God bless you all.
The scenes are being repeated across the kingdom as the nation celebrates the end of nearly 6 years of war in Europe. In our long history, Mr. Churchill said, tonight we have never seen a greater day than this. Here in London and in every city, town and village across the land, it's been a day of thanksgiving and celebration. The war in Europe, which for Britain has lasted 5 years and 8 months, is finally over. The long-awaited news was confirmed at 3 o'clock this afternoon in a broadcast from Downing Street. The Prime Minister gave details of the German surrender. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight. And later, to cheers from MPs, Mr. Churchill told the House of Commons that our dear Channel Islands, the only part of His Majesty's dominions to be occupied by the German foe, are to be freed today. The celebrations are reaching their climax tonight. At the centre of the day's events has been the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and the crowds have loved him.
This is the day we thought would never come. After nearly 6 years of grueling war in Europe, it's all over. And in a spontaneous eruption of national relief, the people of London took to the streets today. The dark shadow of the swastika and everything it stood for has been removed from our lives. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, the official announcement came from the man who is perhaps more associated with the great victory than anyone else.
This is London. The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Winston Churchill.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
After his historic broadcast, Mr. Churchill was driven in an open car from number 10 towards Parliament, a journey he's made hundreds of times, but never like this. The crowds just didn't want to let him go, and he arrived a quarter of an hour late. After addressing the House of Commons, where he was loudly cheered by MPs on all sides, Mr. Churchill joined a procession led by the Speaker to St. Margaret's Church in Westminster for a service of thanksgiving, again surrounded by people who'd been waiting all day to catch a glimpse of their war leader. Earlier in the day, the Prime Minister had been driven to Buckingham Palace to lunch with the King. and he became possibly the first man in history to walk in smoking a cigar. He returned to the palace later in the afternoon. There, together with other members of the coalition government and the chiefs of staff, the Prime Minister posed for pictures with His Majesty. Then came the rare privilege of appearing on the balcony of the palace with the King and Queen and the two princesses, Elizabeth still in uniform. Then Mr. Churchill again had to fight his way back through the throngs of people to the offices of the Ministry of Health in Whitehall. Another balcony, another crowd.
This is your victory. God bless you all.
There's no doubt that this will be very much remembered as Churchill's Day.
But the Prime Minister told the crowds it was their day, and all over the country people have been celebrating. Flags have been brought out of attics, church bells have pealed, and the centres of our towns have been lit up with floodlights and with fireworks.
Exuberant crowds have been flooding the West End of London all day. 100,000 in Trafalgar Square alone, according to police estimates. Strangers embraced, kissing and cheering, overjoyed that after 5 years and 8 months, the agony of war in Europe has at last come to an end. The entire country was celebrating victory. In Edinburgh, thousands gathered to hear Mr. Churchill's triumphant VE message relayed by the BBC.
Signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land.
There was dancing in the city's squares and in the back streets too. As throughout the country, in Glasgow, the returning men were the heroes of the day, and they hung out the flags for our American and Russian allies too. Victory buses have been touring the streets in the north of England, and everywhere bonfires are being built and effigies of Hitler prepared for burning tonight. A typical street party in Gateshead, one of thousands being held in England. Rationing has proved a challenge to the women providing the party fare, but there's nothing lacking in the atmosphere. Rolling out the barrel may not be so easy. Fearing a repetition of the drunken scenes at the end of the last Great War, brewers have refused to supply extra beer. However, the police have reported very few unpleasant incidents today. A nation intoxicated not by alcohol, but by news of victory. Tonight, with a thrill of anticipation, everyone is looking forward to midnight, when the war against Germany will officially come to an end.
In his broadcast tonight from Buckingham Palace, the King paid a solemn tribute to those who are not here to celebrate victory in Europe. In the Far East, we have yet to deal with the Japanese, a determined and cruel foe, he called them. And then he spoke about those who have given their lives in defence of freedom.
Let us remember those who will not come back. Their constancy and courage in battle, their sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. We shall have failed, and the blood of our dearest will have flowed in vain, if the victory which they died to win does not lead to a lasting peace founded on justice and goodwill.
It was 9 o'clock in the morning in Washington when President Truman broadcast to the American people. With the war against Japan in mind, he said, "Our victory is but half won." In fact, Americans have been celebrating for the last 24 hours after a European reporter broke the news embargo.
For most New Yorkers, VE Day actually came yesterday. Hundreds of thousands of people clogged Times Square, and at least 1,000 tons of paper was thrown out of windows in celebration. News spread of the impending German surrender through radio broadcasts and newspapers yesterday after one reporter in Europe broke a Supreme Headquarters embargo and jumped the gun on today's official announcement. In San Francisco, news of the German capitulation arrived as the Soviet Foreign Minister, Mr. Molotov, was speaking to the United Nations. Although there was palpable rejoicing among the diplomats gathered there, for the people of this Pacific city, there's still an overriding sense that their war is not yet over. Among soldiers and sailors in particular, there's a feeling that their lives may still be in jeopardy as the war with Japan moves towards its bloody conclusion. Today, President Harry Truman officially announced VE Day in an address to his people timed to coincide with those in Europe.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Today in Paris, meanwhile, the boulevards were choked with people, a day-long party fueled by the government's decision to give everyone an extra bottle of wine on the ration. General de Gaulle laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier and described the war as a victory for the Allies and for the newly formed United Nations.
In Germany, the acting Führer Admiral Dönitz broadcast early this morning from the only radio station that remains in German hands. He said he had ordered the unconditional surrender of all fighting forces in all theatres of war. He went on, "We must face facts squarely. The foundations on which the German Reich was built have collapsed." Germany is completely defeated, its cities destroyed, its people stunned. The BBC's Winfried Vaughan-Thomas was in the town square of Lüneburg, near Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters, when the surrender was announced there this afternoon.
Hello, BBC. This is Winfried Vaughan-Thomas reporting to you from Germany. This is VE Day in Germany. And here in the old town of Lüneburg, we're standing in the main square where the Germans have assembled. They've been told to assemble by loudspeaker to listen to an important announcement. And now they stand before the old town hall in a docile crowd.
People of Lüneburg, the Nazi government and the German Wehrmacht has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied expeditionary forces. Europe has been brought to misery and famine by Germany. The German nation must not expect to fare better than the nations they have overrun.
The announcement has been made. The surrender terms have been given to the citizens of Lüneburg. They pause for a moment, and then, without comment, the crowd starts to disperse. We, who are in the crowd in British uniforms, can imagine a different VE Day in Britain. We can picture your excitement and the cheering and the flags. Here, in the town square of Lüneburg, is the other side of the picture.
That report from Winfried Vaughan-Thomas. Finally tonight, now it can be told, the weather forecast, which has been censored for the past 5.5 years, classed as information which could be helpful to the enemy. London was the warmest place in the British Isles today, despite the rain. The temperatures tomorrow will again be in the 70s, but thundery showers will be widespread with some coastal fog in the northeast. The outlook for the next few days, unsettled. Finally, the headlines again. In Europe, the war is over. Germany has surrendered. On the other side of the world, British servicemen are still fighting the unconquered enemy, Japan. But across Britain tonight, people are celebrating Victory in Europe Day. From the BBC in London, good night.